Well, my name is Jay Moody, and my mother was Ethel Larsen Moody, and she was Mervin's dad's older sister. So our grandfather put together what is known as Larsen Ranch today, and our great-grandparents, I'm sorry, on our grandmother's side came to the Wood River back in the 1890s. So that's kind of my relationship to Mervin and to the ranch.
Yes, I'm Mervin Larsen, and Jay's cousin. Ralph Larsen was my dad, and he was the youngest son of Henry and Helen Larsen.
Well, he was born in Wisconsin, and his father was a blacksmith. And as a young man, I think that our grandfather decided that there was more opportunity to the west than there was in Wisconsin where he grew up. I don't think he saw himself as a dairy farmer.
Right.
And I don't think he wanted to be a blacksmith.
No,
All
there was his father died, or mother, or one.
His mother died pretty early, I believe. And he worked his way west, just working for ranches and farms, just gradually made his way westward. And he came west with a friend of his. And I'm not sure where they hooked up. Do you remember about Dave Kaiser?
I know the name, and I know they traveled together or worked together when they arrived in this part of the country.
Yeah, and our grandfather came here, I think, early to mid 1890s. I don't know exactly what year it was that he took his homestead on Gooseberry.
Yeah, I think he came over the Bighorns in 1896, and I believe he got a job as chore boy at the bar TL. Was one of his first jobs. He would have been approximately 20 years old.
He was born in 1876. Our grandmother Larsen, Helen Larsen, her family had come to the Wood River a few years earlier. They came in 1893. And so they were pretty well established in that community by the time he came. And he and our grandmother got married in Basin in November 1909. Well, our great-grandfather died in 1914, and following his death, our grandmother got a small amount of money and some livestock from his estate. And so that sort of was the beginning of building their herd.
Yes.
And the home that our grandparents built on the Wood River was actually a house that was constructed up near where the Double D Dude Ranch is now. And it was, I don't know if the house was ever occupied, but it was built, they were going to build a power plant there to generate electricity for Kerwin, and this house had been constructed there, and our grandfather disassembled that house and hauled it down in individual logs and pieces and rebuilt it as their ranch home.
Later, they put a full basement under it after the house was already there. I'm not sure who the old guy was with a horse and a slip or Fred zone. They had a ramp down into under the house, and he brought the dirt out one scoop at a time and dumped it over the bank.
Well,
And we were always good, from my grandfather on down, good stewards of the land, I think. We avoided overgrazing, and we tried to develop water reservoir springs and such, which water is probably as important or more important than grass.
I remember our grandfather always said that we have to take care of the land because the land is what gives us our living. If we don't take care of the land, we won't have a living. And he lived that. He was adamant about that. He taught his children that, and his children taught our generation that. And I think he's absolutely the first conservationist I ever knew. For our grandfather, the ranch was his business, and it was his only business. And when he was procuring homesteads, he was procuring them to increase the size of his ranching business. And as a result, we didn't always get the mineral rights. Some ranch owners really focused on gaining mineral rights with each purchase of additional property, and our grandfather was not concerned about that. His first and foremost goal was to increase the grazing capacity and the land base of his ranching business.
I think that's one thing that makes the ranch unique among larger ranches is we receive no income, or virtually none, from oil or gas or minerals. Our grandfather, he had a homestead on Upper Gooseberry Creek, but it was later sold to the Antler Ranch. And then he purchased, I believe, our great uncle's homesteads on Wood River. There was Bill Hagberry, and later on we purchased Dan Hagberry's homestead, which had been owned by Frank Blackburn, who was a longtime Park County sheriff. And were there any others up there? Did John have a homestead?
John did have a homestead.
John Hagberry.
But it was purchased by Ernest May Sr. in the Antlers Ranch early on. And our grandfather Henry Larsen also bought a small piece of the original W. Barr Ranch, which was across the river from the home place that our grandparents built. And it was, the W Bar was the earliest ranch on the Wood River, I believe.
Yes,
And
right. They have the earliest water right, or one of them, on the entire Greenville River system.
through the years, you asked if it grew, and yes, indeed it did. As Mervin said, it kind of initially began as one homestead at a time, and then in later years, in the 30s and the 40s, in that kind of general period of time, they were able to buy smaller ranches that had been put together by other people through the years. They bought the ranch that belonged to Ray Benyon in the, I think, in the early 40s.
1944, I believe.
And then in the 50s, they, our grandparents bought the, in the late 50s, the ranch that was put together by John Webster. That was purchased from his children, Jack Webster and Elizabeth Spear Webster, I believe.
Yeah.
And that. And then in the late 60s, well, in the early 60s, about 1961, our grandfather created Larsen Ranch Company as a corporation.
Yes. Up until that time, the individual family members owned their own livestock and each owned property, and it was a kind of an unwieldy situation.
And
Especially at brandings when you had 4 or 5 different brands to use.
And so I believe our grandparents decided that the best way to move the ranch ownership forward was to form a corporation. And so they did that, and then in probably the late 60s or maybe the early 70s,
Late 60s, I believe.
they bought the Dollar Ranch, which is out on the Gooseberry drainage.
That was a fairly significant purchase. It amounted to a couple thousand acres, I believe. And that pretty much makes up the Larsen Ranch, except probably 6 or 8 years ago we purchased 160 acres from the LU Ranch in the head of Elk Creek, which is in the Gooseberry drainage also. Started out with Herefords, which that was kind of the only breed back in the early 1900s.
Virtually all the ranches in this region ran Herefords at that point. And I think that we got the first Angus in the mid-50s.
50s, I believe. Curtis and Dad went to Montana and purchased around 150 head of Angus cows, which was the start of the Angus-based herd, which we maintain today. We did do some crossbreeding back in the 90s with limousine and so little bit of Solaire, but we found that the quality of the Angus now is such that we can get the winning weights without crossbreeding. When I was young, we had one stud that we bred several mares to. I'm not sure if there were more than, his name was Rex.
And I've seen some photographs of our grandfather with a stud horse early on, but I don't know any of the history about him, other than I've seen the photographs, and my mother used to say that he was a favorite stud horse of our grandfather's, but I don't remember. But as far as having a horse breeding program, we didn't ever have a
No.
horse breeding program.
Yeah, horses were basically a tool for us, not a source of income.
So you didn't go into the racing like the Pitchfork did.
No. And well, the Gould Ranch got into horse racing really big. No, horses were never a primary object of the ranch.
And I think each Mervin and I were given horses when we were pretty young. I know that our uncle Curtis gave me a mare, I don't know, when I was maybe 12 or 13 or something. And she was the mother of all of the horses that I personally had throughout all the time I was on the ranch and afterward.
Yes.
And
My grandfather bought me it was a half Shetland mare. She was not a real good saddle horse, and she was mean, but we did breed her. I think I ended up with 6 colts out of her that were excellent cow horses.
And the mare that Curtis gave me, she had rickets as a colt, so she was never broken to ride or drive or anything. But she had a marvelous, gentle disposition, and all of her colts were just wonderful horses.
When I was first remember, most of the haying was done with horses. We had, then later on, we stacked with the overshot stacker, and your dad had the little Jeep that he ran the stacker with. But we still mowed and raked with horses. And then we got a couple of the little gray Ford tractors and the 8 ends.
Yeah, the 8 ends. Those were the first tractors the ranch had.
Yes, and we may still have 1 or 2 of them.
And those were the tractors that Mervin and I learned to drive tractor on, those very tractors.
Yes.
And they were the first, I think, well, probably one was used to mow with,
Yes.
And then one was, the other one I think was primarily set up to carry the buck rake in the hay field.
Yes.
Because I remember in the earliest years of being in the hay field, there was only that one tractor that was a buck rake, and the rest of the buck rakes were still horse-powered.
Yes.
And then we got, I don't remember, in the early 60s when Sputnik came along, remember?
Yes.
And Sputnik was a converted car that was rigged up so it ran primarily in reverse.
Yes.
They cut away the body of the car, and so it was just essentially the chassis and the engine. And then there was an old
And turn the seat around.
and the seat was actually an old dump rake seat.
Yes.
That an old horse-drawn dump rake seat that was mounted on the floor of the car, and the steering wheel was turned around, but the dashboard with all of the instrumentation and the starter and was behind you. And in retrospect, it probably was kind of a dangerous machine to run.
Undoubtedly.
But boy, it could tear across the
It was
field.
fast.
When we started in the field, in the hay field, Mervin, I know, started driving the 8N buck rake.
Yes.
And then we got Sputnik, and Mervin, being the seasoned driver, got Sputnik, and I got the 8N tractor as my buck rake.
I don't remember for sure when we switched from loose hay stacks to bales.
That was about 1965 or 6, somewhere in there, I
Probably.
think.
Then the bales were all hand stacked. We used the buck rakes actually to gather the bales in the field and bring them to the stack, and then had a farmhand to put them on the stack. But I don't know if you got in on stacking bales, but my cousin and I stacked thousands of bales by hand. And then later on, my brother-in-law, Randy Kruger, was on the stacking crew.
And we had a very specific stacking pattern. Remember?
Yes,
I don't remember where that came from, but I remember it.
we had really nice stacks, and they were tight. The water didn't go down through them.
Yeah, it was a matter of, well, on the ranch, it always was a matter of pride about the haystacks.
Yes,
When they were stacking loose hay, it had to be done right, or the hired hands that were doing the stacking got a pretty good lecture about how you do a proper stack. And haying season was really the primary time when we had any outside help hired. Otherwise, it was primarily just the family. But during haying season, we generally had a small number of single men or kids
Yes.
the high school kids or just out of high school that worked the hay field.
And the haystackers got a bonus. They made $10 a day instead of the 8 that the common laborer were getting.
And there was no greater shame for the hay stackers than if 3 or 4 days after a stack had been built, you go out in the field and it's lying on its side.
Yes.
And that didn't, I remember that happening maybe once or twice, but not more than that.
And then we got the mechanical bale wagon, and those stacks did fall down
Yes, they would occasionally.
regularly. You had to be quite careful.
Yeah, getting that initial load placed right was a real challenge.
Did you run the bale wagon?
Yes.
I thought you and I were the primary operators.
Yeah, but that time, by the mid-70s, Mervin and I did the Mervin baled and I did all the stacks. And Mervin's dad ran the swather, because by that time we'd advanced from having the tractor mounted mower
Yes.
to the swather or windrower, whatever you prefer to call it. And my dad would occasionally move in and out of the crew. Sometimes he would relieve the cut for Ralph's dad, or for Ralph, and I think we kept our first baler, and occasionally he would run a second baler. But Mervin and essentially the hay crew in those years, from the 70s into the 80s, was just Ralph and Mervin and I, just the 3 of us, which was a major difference from when we were kids, and there were 10 or 12 people that made up the hay crew.
Yeah, our grandmother used to feed, I don't know how big a crew.
Well, at one point,
It was,
she actually ran the hay crew, and when my mother was old enough, my mother cooked for the hay crew, because our grandmother ran a buck rake as a part of the hay crew, and she was essentially the point person on the hay crew at that point in time. Because our grandfather was out with the livestock, either out on Gooseberry or up on one of the Forest Service range leases that the ranch had.
well, there was a grasshopper mill, William Stark. He actually worked for our grandfather, and we also purchased his homestead.
Yes, and my brand is one which our grandfather bought from William Stark at the time that he bought the homestead from him. William Stark, aka Grasshopper Bill, also worked for my grandfather in fulfilling the contract that our grandfather had to take mail to Kerwin. And I know that in your collection you have several photographs of him, some of which were at Kerwin. And so he fulfilled that contract for our grandfather. I've never seen any photographs of our grandfather doing the mail route to Kirwan, but I know he had the contract and hired Grasshopper Bill to fulfill that contract. Then there was Irish, he worked for our grandfather.
Yes,
His actual name was William Connolly.
yes,
When I remember when I was a little boy, we had a pair of workhorses that had belonged to Irish.
yes.
Sadie was one, and I don't
Yeah.
remember the other ones. The other
Sadie
horse.
was, I learned to drive a horse on the dump rake with Sadie in the hayfield when I was fairly young.
Yeah, we got to start in the hayfield pretty young.
That was, I guess, the origin of the Larsen Ranch.